The moving truck hummed away, leaving only dust in its wake as Tariq Rahman wiped sweat from his brow. The journey from Earth had been long, but finally they were here, their new home on Proxima Colony. The house stood before them, a curious blend of Earth architecture and alien design elements. Its smooth white walls captured the orange-pink glow of the twin suns overhead, while crystalline windows refracted light in rainbow patterns across the front yard. "It's beautiful," whispered Amina, his wife, squeezing his hand. Their children, Zara and Omar, aged 10 and 8, stood frozen in awe, taking in the strange new world around them. The neighborhood stretched out in neat rows of similar houses, but everything else was wonderfully alien. Purple-leafed trees swayed in the light breeze, their branches reaching toward the peach-colored sky. The air smelled different too, slightly sweet with hints of something like cinnamon. But what captured the children's attention most were the Keldorians, the amphibious aliens who made up the majority of the colony's population. Several walked past on the main path, their blue-green skin glistening slightly in the sunlight. Their long limbs moved with a grace that seemed almost like dancing, and the gill flaps on their necks pulsed rhythmically as they breathed. "Do you think they'll like us, Papa?" Zara whispered, moving closer to her father's side. Tariq opened his mouth to answer with the reassurance he'd been practicing during their journey, but before he could speak, a shadow fell across them. A tall Keldorian with mottled blue skin stood at the edge of their property. He was imposing, nearly 7 feet tall with broad shoulders and eyes that seemed to shine like polished amber. Unlike the others they'd seen who wore colorful fabrics, this Keldorian wore a simple gray tunic that emphasized his stern demeanor. The gill flaps on his neck pulsed rapidly, which Tariq recognized from his cultural training as a sign of agitation. "Keep your earth noise down," the neighbor hissed, his voice surprisingly melodic despite the harsh words. "We don't need your kind disturbing our peace." The children shrank back behind their parents. Amina's hand tightened around Tariq's, a silent plea for him not to make things worse. Tariq nodded politely, despite the insult burning in his chest. He fought the urge to explain who he was, that he hadn't come to disturb anyone's peace, but rather to ensure it. As the newly appointed chief of colonial security, he could have instantly put this neighbor in his place, but that wasn't why he was here. "We'll be respectful neighbors," Tariq said simply. "I'm Tariq Rahman, and this is my family." The Keldorian's eyes narrowed, and without introducing himself, he turned and walked back to his home next door. Amina sighed. "Well, that could have gone better." "It will take time," Tariq said, helping Omar with a box of his belongings. "We knew that when we accepted this position." He had specifically requested that his family move in a week before his official start date. Better to let them see him as just another human family first, to understand the daily reality of integration before he put on the uniform. The colony administrators had warned him about pockets of resistance to the human integration initiative, but experiencing it firsthand was different. As evening fell, turning the alien sky into a canvas of deep purples and blues, the Rahman family settled into their new home. The house systems hummed unfamiliarly, and the gravity felt slightly off, just enough to make them move a bit slower than usual. That night, as the children finally drifted to sleep in their new rooms, Tariq and Amina unpacked kitchen supplies. Through the surprisingly thin walls, they heard their neighbors speaking to others. The Keldorian language was musical, rising and falling like water, but the universal translator they'd installed picked up the conversation clearly. "These humans think they can just invade our spaces now," the voice, now identified as someone named Zelgur, complained. "This colony was perfect before they came. Their smell, their noise, their strange foods. It's all so primitive. And now they put them right next to me." Another voice, softer, tried to offer a different perspective. "The integration directive comes from both governments, Zelgur. Humans have technical skills we lack." "Skills?" Zelgur scoffed. "They're barely out of their stone age. My grand spawn could outthink their brightest minds." Amina looked at Tariq, her eyes sad. Maybe we should have told them who you are. No, Tariq shook his head. I need to understand what people really think, not how they act around the new security chief. This is exactly why we came early. A small sound from the doorway caught their attention. Omar stood there in his Earth-themed pajamas, his dark eyes wide with concern. Papa, he said quietly, walking to his father. I couldn't sleep. I heard the blue neighbor talking. Tariq lifted his son onto his lap, feeling how small he was in this big new world. Omar clutched his father's hand. Why does he hate us already? Omar asked, confusion clear in his voice. He doesn't even know us. Tariq exchanged a glance with Amina before smiling gently at his son. Sometimes people fear what's different, little one. They worry that change might take away something they value. But we're not taking anything, Omar protested. I know, Tariq said, stroking his son's hair. And in time, they'll know that too. Being first isn't easy, but it's important. Remember how your grandfather was one of the first Muslim officers in his police department on Earth? People didn't understand then either. But they did later. Omar remembered the stories. Yes, they did. And that will happen here too, Tariq promised. But it takes patience and kindness, even when others aren't kind to us. Can you be brave for me? Omar nodded solemnly, and Tariq felt a surge of pride. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, he held his son close, gazing out the window at the unfamiliar stars, carrying the weight of being first with the quiet determination that had defined his career. Trust me, he whispered, more to himself than to his son. This will change. We will make it change. 2 weeks passed on Proxima Colony, and the Rahman family worked hard to make their alien house feel like home. Amina spent her morning in the small plot behind their dwelling, carefully planting the seedlings they had brought from Earth. The soil here was different, richer in minerals that gave it a faint purple tint, but the colony agricultural department had assured her that Earth plants would thrive with minimal adjustments. She knelt in the warm dirt, pressing tiny basil and mint seeds into the ground. The familiar sense of home would help the children adjust, she thought. Behind her, a row of chili peppers already showed the first green shoots, reaching toward the twin suns. What are you doing to our soil? Amina startled at the harsh voice. Zelger stood at the edge of their garden, his blue skin darkening around his neck flaps, a sign of agitation she had quickly learned to recognize. Just planting a small herb garden, she explained, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her knees. All approved varieties from the colony's permitted list. Zelger's amber eyes narrowed. Those are Earth plants. They don't belong here. The agricultural department reviewed them all. Amina said calmly, though her heart beat faster. They pose no risk to native species. That's what humans always say before they take over, Zelger muttered, his gill flaps pulsating rapidly. First a garden, then what? Replacing our trees with your Earth plants. Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked stiffly back to his home. That afternoon, a message flashed on their home terminal. A formal complaint had been filed against the Rahman residents for unauthorized introduction of potentially invasive Earth species that threaten the ecological balance of Proxima Colony's carefully maintained environment. When Tariq returned home that evening, Amina showed him the complaint with a sigh. All I planted were cooking herbs, Tariq. Everything was from the approved list. Tariq scanned the document. He's just using the official channels to harass us. The complaint will be dismissed. He didn't mention that he had already seen it cross his desk at the security office and had made sure it was properly processed rather than receiving special treatment. How was your day? Amina asked, changing the subject as she stirred a pot of fragrant curry. Before Tariq could answer, the front door slid open and Zara trudged in, her school bag dragging behind her. Omar followed, unusually quiet. While Omar headed straight to his room, Zara came to the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed. What's wrong, sunshine? Tariq asked, kneeling to his daughter's level. "Nothing," she mumbled, but her quivering lip betrayed her. Amina set down her cooking spoon. "Zara, tell us what happened." The girl looked down at her hands. "At recreation period, I asked to join the ball game the Keldorian children were playing. They said," her voice broke slightly, "they said humans are too fragile to play their games, that we would break our bones and cry." Tarek felt a flash of anger, but kept his voice gentle. "Did they let you try?" Zara shook her head. "They said colony rules don't allow mixed species games because of the liability. But I checked the school handbook on my tablet, and there's no such rule." "What about Omar?" Amina asked. "He stayed in the library again. He says he prefers reading, but I think he's afraid to even ask to play." Tarek pulled his daughter into a hug. "Tomorrow's a new day. Perhaps we can invite some of your classmates over sometime. Show them that humans aren't as fragile as they think." Zara nodded against his shoulder, but her enthusiasm seemed forced. Later that evening, as the twin suns began to set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Tarek noticed unusual activity outside. Keldorians from several houses were gathering at Zelger's home, carrying containers of food and drink. Children ran between the adults, playing some sort of tag game that involved touching gill flaps. "Looks like a party," Amina said, joining him at the window. And clearly, we weren't invited. They watched as nearly 20 neighbors congregated in Zelger's front yard. Music with the distinctive underwater tones of Keldorian cultural songs drifted through the open windows. Several of the gathering looked toward the ramen house, their expressions unreadable to human eyes, but their body language suggesting discomfort. "Shouldn't you tell them who you are?" Amina asked, resting her head on Tarek's shoulder. "You start officially tomorrow. It might make things easier if they didn't think we were just random human immigrants." Tarek shook his head, watching as a young Keldorian pointed at their house and was quickly shushed by an adult. "I want to earn respect, not demand it. If they only treat us well, because I'm the new security chief, nothing really changes. And if they continue to exclude our children, file complaints about our garden, then we'll address those issues properly, through the right channels." He turned from the window. "This was never going to be easy, Amina. We're the first human family in this neighborhood. Change takes time." She nodded, though her eyes showed doubt. "I just hope the children don't suffer too much while we wait for that change." The next morning, Tarek left early, dressed in plain clothes, simple brown pants, and a blue tunic that would help him blend with the mixed population in the colony's central district. He kissed Amina goodbye at the door. "Will you be home for dinner?" she asked. "I'll try. First days can be unpredictable." He glanced at the children eating breakfast inside. "Tell them I'm proud of how brave they're being." As he walked down the residential path, he noticed Zelger watching from his window. The Keldorian's eyes followed him suspiciously. None of the neighbors knew he was heading to colony security headquarters, where his uniform and rank awaited. By midday, his official introduction would be broadcast on the colony's information channels, and everyone would know that the human they had been avoiding was actually Chief Rahman, the new head of colonial security. But for now, he was just another human walking to work, carrying the weight of being first, the burden of building bridges between worlds that had only recently begun to understand each other. Each step took him closer to his new office, and further from the family that bore this burden with him, facing the daily reality of being different in a place that wasn't yet ready to welcome them. Friday evening brought warm rain to Proxima Colony, gentle droplets that tapped rhythmically against the roof of the Rahman home. The rain here was different from Earth's, slightly warmer and carrying a faint scent like fresh mint. It created a cozy atmosphere inside as the family gathered for their end-of-week traditions. In the living room, Zara and Omar had pushed the furniture aside to make space for their games. They were playing Earth Tag, a game they'd invented that combined traditional tag with hopscotch patterns drawn on the floor with light projectors. Their laughter bounced off the walls as they dodged each other, occasionally stumbling and dissolving into more giggles. "No fair. You can't use the blue squares as safe zones," Omar protested when his sister evaded his tag for the 5th time. "Can too. We never said they weren't safe," Zara countered, her eyes bright with mischief. In the kitchen, Amina swayed gently to the music playing from their home system. Traditional songs from their homeland that reminded them of family gatherings back on Earth. The spices from her cooking added to the sensory tapestry, cardamom, turmeric, and cinnamon floating through the house. She was preparing biryani, the children's favorite dish, layering rice and vegetables in a large pot. It was their first truly relaxed evening since arriving on the colony. Tariq had completed his first week as chief of security, though their neighbors still didn't know. He had promised to be home early, and the children were excited to share their school experiences with him, the good parts, at least. Next door, Zelgur paced angrily across his living space. His home's sensitive audio receptors, designed for the acute hearing of Keldorians, picked up every sound from the human dwelling. The children's feet thumping on the floor, their high-pitched laughter, the strange rhythmic music with its unfamiliar instruments. It all grated on his nerves like sand in a gill pouch. He had spent 3 cycles on this colony, establishing himself as a respected botanical researcher. His neighborhood had been peaceful, populated by like-minded scientists and their families. Then the integration initiative had brought humans, and not just any humans, a family with young ones, directly next door to his quiet home. The pulsing in his neck flaps increased as a particularly loud burst of laughter penetrated his walls. This was unacceptable. His research on native plant adaptation required concentration, and these earth creatures had disrupted his work all week. Zelgur moved to his communication panel, his long blue fingers hovering over the controls for a moment. He had filed complaints about their garden and reported their children's inappropriate questions at the education center. Nothing had changed. It was time for more direct action. He activated his comm. "Colonial security. Yes, I need to report a disturbance," he said, his melodic voice tight with restraint. "The new humans at Unit 47B. They're disrupting the entire neighborhood with their earth noise and strange activities." The dispatcher asked for details, and Zelgur elaborated, describing the pounding vibrations and disruptive frequencies coming from their home. He emphasized that several neighbors were affected, though he hadn't actually consulted any of them. "We'll send officers to assess the situation," the dispatcher assured him. Zelgur ended the call, feeling a flush of satisfaction spread through his gill flaps. Let them experience some consequences for their inconsiderate behavior. Perhaps they would finally understand that they needed to adapt to Proxima's culture, not impose their earthways on established neighborhoods. 20 minutes later, Zelgur noticed the approach of an official vehicle with colonial security markings. He moved to his window, watching as 3 officers exited, 2 Keldorians in the standard blue and silver uniforms, and 1 human officer. Perfect. The human would see how his own kind were expected to behave in a civilized colony. The officers walked up to the Raman residence with professional efficiency. The lead Keldorian officer, tall even by their standards with distinguished age markings on his gill flaps, knocked on the door. Zelgur leaned closer to his window, smiling with satisfaction. Inside the Raman home, the knock interrupted their evening. Amina turned down the music with a gesture and went to the door, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She was surprised to find security officers on her doorstep. "Good evening, ma'am," said the lead Keldorian officer respectfully. His tone lacked the dismissive quality Zelgur would have preferred. "We received a noise complaint about this residence." Amina's eyes widened slightly. "A noise complaint? I'm sorry, we were just having our family evening. The children were playing games, and I was cooking dinner." The children had stopped their game and now stood in the hallway behind their mother, their expressions uncertain. Omar moved closer to his sister, seeking reassurance. The human officer, a younger man with the name Chin on his uniform, studied the family with growing recognition in his eyes. "Wait, you're Mrs. Rahman." does that mean?" His words trailed off as his comm unit beeped with an incoming message. He stepped back slightly to answer it. "Officer Chen," he said, touching the device at his collar. His expression changed as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, sir. We're at your residence now. A complaint was filed by your neighbor." The two Keldorian officers exchanged glances, their gill flaps pulsing with what appeared to be confusion. "Is something wrong?" Amina asked, still holding the kitchen towel in her hands. Officer Chen looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we were responding to a noise complaint, but I've just been informed that this residence is." He glanced at his Keldorian colleagues, who seemed equally perplexed. The lead Keldorian officer stepped forward. "Perhaps we should come inside and discuss this matter properly." From his window, Zelger watched with growing impatience. Why were they being invited inside? The procedure should be simple: issue a warning, record the incident, and leave. Instead, the officers were entering the human dwelling with what appeared to be deference. Something was wrong. Inside, Amina led the officers to their living room, quickly clearing away the children's game projectors. "I apologize for any disturbance," she said. "We weren't aware we were being too loud." "Actually, Mom," Officer Chen said, "according to our sound monitoring, your residence is well within acceptable parameters for residential areas during evening hours. The complaint appears to be—" He hesitated, searching for diplomatic wording. "Perhaps an overreaction." The lead Keldorian officer added, "We must respond to all complaints, but our readings show nothing exceeding colony guidelines." Zara looked at the officers with curiosity. "Are we in trouble?" The second Keldorian officer, who had remained silent until now, made a sound that might have been a chuckle. "No, young human. There appears to be a misunderstanding." Officer Chen's comm beeped again. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to answer once more. Outside, Zelger continued watching, his satisfaction turning to confusion as the minutes passed with no officers emerging. What was taking so long? Surely verifying a noise complaint should be a simple matter. He was about to turn away when a new vehicle approached, a sleek black transport with official markings. His confusion deepened as a familiar figure stepped out, dressed in the distinctive uniform of Colonial Security's highest rank. It was the human father from next door. Tariq Rahman was finishing a meeting with the colonial governor when the call came through about a noise complaint at his own address. He excused himself politely but quickly, explaining that a family matter required his attention. The governor, a senior Keldorian with distinguished silver markings across his gill flaps, nodded in understanding. "Family comes first, Chief Rahman. That is something our cultures share." As his official vehicle glided through the colony's central district, Tariq reviewed the complaint details on his tablet. Zelger had filed 3 separate complaints against his family in 2 weeks. Each one had been professionally processed through the system, and each had been found without merit. This pattern was concerning from a community relations standpoint. The vehicle turned into their residential area, its quiet hum attracting attention from neighbors enjoying the warm evening rain. Unusual to see an official security transport in this scholarly neighborhood. A few Keldorians stepped out onto their front paths, curiosity evident in their posture. Tariq arrived at his home 30 minutes after the officers had first knocked on his door. He stepped out of the official vehicle, his uniform crisp and formal, the silver and blue insignia of Chief of Colonial Security prominently displayed on his chest and shoulders. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and misty. More neighbors had gathered outside, watching with undisguised interest as the scene unfolded. Inside his home, Officer Chen was carefully explaining to Amina that no violation had occurred when his communication device alerted him to the chief's arrival. The officers moved toward the door as Tariq approached. Next door, Zelger stood frozen at his window, his gill flaps fluttering rapidly in shock. The human he had been reporting, complaining about, and disparaging to other neighbors was wearing the uniform of the highest-ranking security official in the colony. His blue skin paled visibly, taking on an ashen quality that reflected his sudden distress. Outside the Rahman residence, the three officers stood at attention as Tariq approached. "At ease," he said calmly, his voice carrying in the quiet evening air. "Report." Officer Chen stepped forward. "False complaint, sir. Noise levels well within regulation. We conducted standard measurements and found nothing exceeding residential parameters." The lead Keldorian officer added, "The children were playing traditional games, and music was at acceptable volume. Nothing that would warrant intervention." Tariq nodded, his expression neutral. "Thank you for your professional response." He glanced toward Zelger's home, noting the face in the window that quickly disappeared from view. Inside his house, Zelger paced frantically. This was disastrous. He had filed multiple complaints against the colony's new security chief, spoken poorly of his family to colleagues, and encouraged others to exclude them. His research position suddenly felt precarious. After a moment of panic, he realized he had little choice but to face the situation directly. Perhaps he could claim ignorance, suggest a misunderstanding. Taking a deep breath that made his gill flaps expand fully, Zelger stepped outside and approached the gathering with as much dignity as he could muster. The neighbors watched with interest as the confrontation they had anticipated unfolded before them. Zelger's blue skin had now taken on a grayish tone, a clear sign of embarrassment to those familiar with Keldorian physiology. "You're the new chief," he stammered, his melodic voice higher than usual. "I am," Tariq said calmly, turning to face him directly. There was no anger in his voice, only a steady professionalism that somehow made Zelger feel worse. "I wanted to be just another neighbor first, to understand the community before leading its security forces." Several neighbors murmured among themselves. One older Keldorian female, a respected physicist from the colony's research center, clicked her tongue, a sound of disapproval clearly directed at Zelger. Tariq continued, "It's standard protocol for new leadership. Living as a regular citizen provides perspectives that can't be gained from an office." Officer Chen looked uncomfortable, likely realizing that he had been responding to complaints against his own superior's family. The Keldorian officers maintained their professional demeanor, though their gill movements suggested they found the situation somewhat amusing. A young Keldorian child broke from the gathering crowd and approached Tariq with the direct curiosity that only children possess. She was perhaps the equivalent of 12 Earth years, with bright amber eyes and lighter blue skin than the adults. "Sir, is it true you stopped the pirate attack in the TAS CD system?" she asked, looking up at him with unconcealed admiration. The adult seemed surprised by this information. The TAV CD incident had been a significant event, a coordinated attack on a joint human-Keldorian science outpost by interstellar raiders. The security response had been celebrated throughout both civilizations as a model of cooperation. Tariq smiled at the child, his stern official demeanor softening. That was a team effort, humans and Keldorians working together. I was fortunate to coordinate with some very brave officers from both our peoples. The girl nodded seriously. My parents' sibling was there. They said a human commander figured out the pirate strategy because humans understand deception better than we do. This comment caused several adult Keldorians to shift uncomfortably. The cultural belief that humans were more skilled in understanding deceptive behavior was something rarely discussed openly. It was considered both a criticism and a reluctant acknowledgement of a useful skill. "Different perspectives make us stronger together," Tariq said diplomatically. "Your parents' sibling showed incredible courage that day." The gathered neighbors whispered among themselves, clearly reassessing the human family in their midst. Many glanced toward Zelger, who stood alone, shame evident in his posture. His gill flaps were now nearly still, pressed close to his neck in the Keldorian equivalent of wishing to disappear. Amina emerged from their home, standing beside Tariq with quiet dignity. The children peered curiously from the doorway, watching the scene unfold. "Perhaps," Tariq said, addressing the gathered crowd, "we might put this misunderstanding behind us. My family and I are grateful to be part of this community. We understand that integration brings challenges, but also opportunities for growth. The older Kildorian physicist stepped forward. Chief Raman, I hope you will accept my invitation to speak at our community gathering next week. Many would benefit from hearing about your experiences with joint security operations. I would be honored, Tarek replied. As the crowd began to disperse, their curious whispers now tinged with respect rather than suspicion. Zelgar remained rooted in place. His academic standing, his reputation in the community, everything seemed suddenly precarious. Tariq turned to him, speaking quietly enough that only Zelgar and the officers could hear. No official record of these complaints will be maintained, he said. Community relations are too important to let misunderstandings create lasting divisions. Zelgar's gill flaps fluttered in surprise. This was not the revenge he had expected. I didn't know, he began weakly. Now you do, Tariq replied simply. Perhaps we can start again, as neighbors should. He extended his hand in the human gesture of reconciliation, leaving Zelgar with a choice that would define how the community saw him moving forward. 3 days passed in a strange new peace on the street where the Ramans lived. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now offered cautious greetings. Several Kildorian parents had approached Amina about arranging playdates with their children. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable, like the first green shoots emerging after a long winter. Zelgar had kept to himself, visible only briefly as he left for his research position each morning. The Ramans gave him space, understanding that pride sometimes needed time to heal. On the 4th day after the incident, Tariq was reviewing security protocols in his office when the emergency alert system activated. A harsh, pulsing tone filled the room as red warning lights flashed on every screen. Atmospheric anomaly detected in Sector 7, announced the colony's AI system. Oxygen levels dropping rapidly. Cause unknown. Tariq was on his feet instantly. Sector 7 housed the colony's primary education center, where most Kildorian families sent their children, including several from his neighborhood. Full emergency response team to Sector 7, he ordered, already moving toward the door. Environmental suits for all responders. I'll meet the team there. His transport cut through the colony at emergency speed, lights flashing as pedestrians cleared the way. Sector 7's distinctive dome came into view, its usual transparent blue now clouded with a faint gray haze inside. Environmental alarms flashed around its perimeter. When Tariq arrived, chaos greeted him. Kildorian parents gathered outside the sealed emergency doors, their gill flaps pulsing frantically. Unlike humans, Kildorians could breathe both air and water, but they required specific oxygen levels in airborne environments. Too little, and they would suffer damage to their respiratory systems. Status report, Tariq demanded as his emergency team assembled. Environmental system malfunction, reported his deputy, a senior Kildorian officer. Oxygen levels at 62% of minimum requirements for Kildorian physiology and dropping. The building's automatic lockdown engaged to prevent further contamination. We have approximately 150 individuals inside, mostly children. Why aren't the emergency oxygen systems engaging? Unknown, sir. Possible sabotage, though more likely a cascading system failure. Tariq scanned the building's schematics on his tablet. We'll need to establish safe corridors for evacuation. Team Alpha, take the east entrance. Team Beta, west. I'll lead central team through the main doors. Priority is the education center classrooms. As the teams prepared, Tariq noticed a familiar figure among the frantic parents. Zelgar, his usual composed demeanor replaced by naked fear. Chief Raman, Zelgar called out, pushing through the crowd. My sister's offspring. My nephew. He's in the advanced botany class. It's in the interior section, with no external windows. Tariq nodded grimly. We'll find him. Moments later, equipped with environmental suits and emergency breathing apparatus for the trapped Kildorians, the teams breached the sealed building. Inside, the air had a strange burnt smell. Warning lights flashed in every corridor as the emergency system advised occupants to remain in place. Tariq led his team through the main hallway, checking classrooms as they progressed. Most had already implemented emergency protocols, with teachers keeping children calm while conserving oxygen. Each room was quickly supplied with emergency breathers and evacuated along the secured corridors. Central team, proceed to interior section, Tariq ordered. Reports indicate 5 classrooms still occupied. The deeper they moved into the building, the worse the air quality became. Their sensors showed oxygen levels dangerously low in the central hub where specialized classrooms were located. The botany classroom door was sealed, an additional safety measure that now trapped those inside. Through the small window, Tariq could see several young Keldorians slumped at their workstations. An adult, presumably the teacher, lay unconscious near the door. "The emergency override isn't responding," reported one of his team members after trying the access panel. Tariq examined the door. "Manual override required. Stand back." Using an emergency tool from his belt, he forced the panel open and rewired the circuit. The door remained stubbornly sealed. "Sir, oxygen levels are critical in there. 2 minutes maximum before permanent damage." Tariq made a quick decision. Breaching charge, minimal force, targeted at the locking mechanism. His team looked surprised. Breaching charges were rarely used in civilian structures, but quickly prepared the device. 30 seconds later, the lock blew with a sharp crack, and the door slid partially open. Tariq squeezed through first, carrying emergency breathers. The scene inside was alarming. Young Keldorians in various states of distress, their gill flaps barely moving as their bodies tried to extract oxygen from the depleted air. Among them, Tariq recognized a young male with markings similar to Zelger's. His nephew, barely conscious at a workstation covered with plant specimens. Working methodically, the team fitted emergency breathers to each child, starting with those in worst condition. The breathers provided a mix perfectly calibrated for Keldorian physiology, supplying their gill systems with the right balance of oxygen and trace minerals. Tariq personally fitted the device to Zelger's nephew, noting the weak pulse in his gill flaps. Within seconds of receiving proper oxygen, the boy's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. 40 minutes later, the crisis was contained. All occupants had been safely evacuated, with 23 requiring medical attention for oxygen deprivation. The cause had been identified as a damaged filtration system that had been improperly repaired, creating a cascading failure. At the medical center, Tariq checked on the status of the affected children. Most were recovering well, with no signs of permanent damage. As he reviewed the reports, a quiet voice spoke behind him. "You saved my nephew," Zelger said, his tone subdued. The young Keldorian lay sleeping in the recovery pod behind them, his gill flaps now pulsing with healthy rhythm. "After how I treated your family." Tariq shook his head. "That's my job. For everyone in this colony." He paused, then added, "How is he doing?" "The doctors say he will recover fully, if you had not reached him when you did." Zelger's voice trailed off, his gill flaps pulsing with emotion. "Then I'm glad we were quick enough," Tariq said simply. 1 month later, the Rahman household buzzed with activity as they prepared for a neighborhood gathering. Amina and the children had spent the day cooking, filling their home with delicious aromas, some familiar earth dishes and some Keldorian specialties they had learned to prepare. Their backyard had been transformed. Strings of soft lights hung from the purple leaf trees, and tables displayed a beautiful blend of cuisine from both worlds. A special table held dishes adapted for Keldorian taste preferences, stronger mineral flavors, and specific textures that appealed to their palates. Neighbors arrived in small groups, bringing additional food and drinks. The atmosphere was relaxed and warm, with children, both human and Keldorian, playing together in games that had been modified to accommodate the different physical abilities of both species. Zahra proudly taught a group of Keldorian children how to play hopscotch, while Omar demonstrated earth card games to others. The adults mingled, sharing stories, and finding unexpected common ground in their experiences. As the evening progressed, one notable absence became apparent. Zelgar had not yet arrived. Tariq caught Amina's questioning glance but simply shrugged. Some changes took more time than others. Just as they were preparing to serve the main dishes, a hush fell over the gathering. Zelgar stood at the garden entrance, looking uncomfortable but determined. In his arms, he carried a small potted plant with silvery blue leaves that seemed to glow slightly in the evening light. He approached Tariq and Amina, his gill flaps pulsing with what they now recognize as nervous energy. "I apologize for my lateness," he said formally. "I needed to prepare this properly." He held out the plant, its roots carefully wrapped in special soil. "On my world," he explained, his voice carrying to the curious children who had gathered around. "When someone has been wrong, they plant this together with those they have harmed. It is called the unity frond. It grows only when both parties care for it, requiring attention from each to flourish." The children looked fascinated, especially Zara and Omar, who moved closer to examine the unusual plant. "It can sense the touch of different species," Zelgar continued, "and it changes color slightly depending on who has most recently tended it. If neglected by either party, it wilts, a visible reminder that harmony requires effort from all sides." Tariq accepted the plant with a nod of understanding. "Where should we plant it?" Zelgar indicated a spot between their two properties. "The roots need to extend into both territories." As Zara and Omar helped dig the small hole for the plant, neighbors gathered to watch this traditional ceremony. Tariq and Zelgar each took turns placing soil around the delicate roots, their hands, 5-fingered and 6-fingered, working side by side. When they finished, Tariq stood and smiled at Amina, taking her hand. "Different doesn't mean we can't grow together," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It just means the garden becomes more interesting." The plant's leaves seemed to shimmer in response, glowing slightly more brightly as if approving this new beginning.